Welcome to the 2020 UCI MIND Distinguished Lecture on Brain Disease. My name is Josh Grill. I'm a faculty member in the UC Irvine Schools of Medicine and Biological Sciences and the director of UCI MIND. 2020 marks the 25th year of UCI MIND as a campus organized research unit, bringing experts from across UCI's many schools and departments together to accelerate research in Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders. Many of you know that UCI is home to Orange County's only federally funded Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and part of our mission is to share with you, our local community, that all that we are learning and indeed involve you in our research. Before I introduce this evening's distinguished visiting lecturer, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd also like to thank several members of the UCI MIND Leadership Council who are here. This group of community and business leaders supports our research mission at events like this one through philanthropy and community engagement. I'd ask the members of this group to stand and be recognized for their important efforts on our behalf. I'd also like to thank the many UCI MIND faculty, trainees, and staff who are here tonight, especially our Dean of the School of Biological Sciences, Dr. Frank LaFurla. The School of Biological Sciences is a sponsor for tonight's event, and perhaps we can give Dean LaFurla and the other researchers who have devoted their careers to studying Alzheimer's disease and other age-related cognitive disorders a round of applause. Lastly, I hope you will stop by the UCI MIND table in the lobby to learn more about upcoming events. There's also information in tonight's program, and the UCI MIND website is constantly an updated resource for you. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our 2020 UCI MIND Barclay Distinguished Lecture on Brain Disease speaker, Dr. Reisa Sperling. Dr. Sperling is a professor of neurology at the Harvard Medical School and director of the Center for Alzheimer's Research and Treatment at Brigham and Women's Hospital. At Harvard, Dr. Sperling is the principal investigator of the Harvard Aging Brain Study, an NIH-funded program project that has made major contributions to our understanding of brain changes that are antecedent to the onset of memory problems and Alzheimer's dementia. Her innovative research over the last 2 decades especially, has provided a critical foundation for national and international clinical trials of interventions that aim to delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease by identifying those at greatest risk and starting treatments a decade before memory problems begin. These trials include the ongoing anti-amyloid treatment in asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease, or A4 study, which is due to be completed in 2020. And starting this spring, she will lead the A345 trials, or AHEAD study, which will begin to go even earlier in preclinical disease and test a more aggressive therapy. She is also the co-principal investigator of the $70 million NIH-funded Alzheimer's Clinical Trial Consortium, or ACTC, in which UCI is a proud member. Dr. Sperling has published hundreds of papers and won numerous awards for her work. But beyond her accolades, she is an inspiration to many of us in the field, certainly including me. Making a difference in the fight against Alzheimer's disease is personal for Reisa. She is a tireless innovator and is leading the field in many ways, including her remarkable commitment to nurturing the next generation of investigators in our field. The field will succeed in changing the way we talk about, care for, and treat people at risk for Alzheimer's disease, and we will point to Reisa for paramount contributions to these successes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reisa Sperling.
Wow. Okay, Josh, you broke your first promise already by making an introduction that I couldn't possibly live up to. So I really want to thank you guys for having me. It's an honor to be here at UC Irvine. partly because you may not know this, but as I'll show you, there's so many people here who contribute to our work, and I want to mention just a couple. So first, you already heard from Dr. Josh Grill's a critical person. I'll show you some of his work. One of my personal heroes ever, Dr. Claudia Kawas. I'm also going to show you some data by Dr. Mike Yasa and Dr. Craig Stark, and many people actually here have contributed to what I'm going to show you in terms of our work on prevention trials. So it's a real honor to be here. And I want to thank all of you who braved both the coronavirus threat and Super Tuesday to come out tonight, so thank you especially. All right. So I'm going to start by going through some Mother Nature analogies. And of course, California is a perfect place to do this because you have such amazing Mother Nature here, but also have seen the brunt of Mother Nature when she's giving you a difficult time. So my first analogy is that of an iceberg. And I want to make the point that what we think of Alzheimer's disease right now is just what we see above the surface, because we think of Alzheimer's disease as being at the stage where people already have significant cognitive symptoms. They have what we call dementia, where they need help with doing things around the house or taking care of themselves. But I think of Alzheimer's disease as beginning in the brain, and as I'll try to make an argument to you, that begins well before the stage that we recognize as people having dementia or cognitive impairment. So this iceberg, this people above the surface here, is really literally the tip of the iceberg of Alzheimer's disease. And because people in this audience and researchers at University of California, Irvine are doing such a good job at keeping people alive longer from heart disease and cancer, unfortunately, we're creating an epidemic of Alzheimer's disease because it's so age-linked. And therefore, our society is heading right for this iceberg, everything that you can't see that's below the surface, which are people who are beginning to develop Alzheimer's disease in their brains and don't yet have symptoms. And our job is to steer the ship away from this and hopefully get to people before we hit this epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. So if you took that iceberg and you turned it on its side, it would look something like this. And you've probably seen curves like this. So first of all, let me start at the top here where it's talking about normal aging. And first of all, you'll notice that the normal is in quotes because as I age, there is nothing normal about it. But I also think we realize that aging is a process and it's complicated. And people always ask me, what's the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's disease? And that's pretty complicated because I think part of what we have called normal aging in some people is this very early stage, which I'll refer to, whoops, I'm going to go back, of preclinical Alzheimer's disease. And preclinical, I'll say here, does not necessarily mean that everybody who has Alzheimer's changes in their brains will progress to develop mild cognitive impairment, MCI, or dementia. Some people will be protected and never progress. Other people will progress so slowly that they won't develop symptoms in their lifetime, and that's terrific. But as I'll try to convince you tonight, I do think this is the stage of Alzheimer's disease that we want to treat, at least with certain therapeutics. So I suspect many of you have been to lectures about Alzheimer's disease before, have seen pictures like this. And of course, this is what Alzheimer's disease looks like under the microscope. And I only want to show it to you tonight so you can see what we can see during life now with PET scans, imaging, and what we can't. So here, these kind of blobby-looking things are plaques. These are collections of a protein we call amyloid beta. And the other pathology are these dark, oops, I'm having a problem with this pointer, sorry. These dark areas that are inside the nerve cells, and these are, of course, called tangles. And you've probably heard this bad joke, but I like to tell it that we've been fighting in our field for about 30 years about whether it's beta amyloid protein or the Baptists, or it's tau tangles versus the Taoists. And one of the other arguments I'm going to make tonight is we should stop fighting about whether it's amyloid or tau, because both are required to cause the kind of memory problems that we see in this disease. All right, so the very good news from my point of view is that about 15 years ago, instead of waiting for someone to have to pass away and get their brain donation, which of course is very important, to make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, some very smart people figured out how we could label those plaques and those tangles to look at in PET scans. And so here is just an example of that. At the stage of Alzheimer's disease dementia, people, all of that pink is how much amyloid plaque is already there, even at the very earliest stages of Alzheimer's dementia. This starts quite early, and by the time people have symptoms, typically, I like to say, they have a head full of amyloid. The good news is that most people who are normal, and the CN stands here for cognitively or clinically normal, most people who are over age 65 don't have much amyloid plaque. But as we and others started to do these PET studies, when we started these, finding these agents, we found that about 30% of people who are still clinically normal already had amyloid plaque buildup in their brains. Now, this was a little bit surprising at first, because if amyloid might be important for Alzheimer's disease, how can you walk around with a head full of amyloid and still be normal? And I'm going to show you some of the reasons I think that occurs, and most importantly, that those people don't stay normal for long. But here's an example of somebody who's clinically normal, comes in, and all these areas of red are in the same parts of the brain where we see amyloid buildup that we later see at the stage of dementia, but it's not quite as much. And again, it's our job, potentially, to prevent it from getting more. So I'm going to show you an example of this, and this is actually an illustration from my colleagues down under in Australia. So this is a curve of the prevalence, we say, of clinical dementia over time. And you can see that this is what we say is an exponential curve, which is actually doubles every decade. So as I said, those of you who are keeping people alive longer, 90 plus, 100 plus, unfortunately, this means that the likelihood of having clinical dementia goes way, way up. Here in green is a series of 3 studies at the time, and now there are about 20, that if you're a normal person, you came in, you did your cognitive testing at UC MIND or the 90 plus study, you were totally normal, and you were just hit by a bus on your way out of the testing session. In green is the likelihood by age that you're still normal, but you have Alzheimer's pathology in your brain sufficient to say this is Alzheimer's disease in the brain. Now, these blue dots are the likelihood of having an amyloid PET scan that also says you have amyloid in your brain. And even though we don't yet know whether all of those blue dots are going to progress over to become red diamonds and develop Alzheimer's disease dementia, we do know that when a PET scan says there's amyloid in the brain, the likelihood that there's amyloid in the brain exceeds 99%. So as a test for amyloid plaques, very good. What we don't, again, know is what is its predictive value in telling us whether those people will go on to develop dementia and over what time frame. So right now, it's suggested that somewhere between 15 and 18 years between the time you have plaque buildup in your brain, sufficient to say your brain has Alzheimer's disease, and the time that you might develop Alzheimer's dementia. Now that seems like a really long time, but my cardiology colleagues tell me that plaques in the arteries of the heart or in the aorta actually begin 30 years before people sometimes would get a heart attack or a stroke. So actually Alzheimer's disease doesn't take as long as some other diseases. For me, this is a glass half full. We potentially have 15 years to try to prevent those blue dots from becoming red diamonds. And that's really what I'm going to focus on tonight. So as I mentioned to you, one of the first questions was, how is it that if amyloid's important for Alzheimer's disease or causing or at least being involved in Alzheimer's disease, how can you have amyloid and still be normal? So we started following these people in the Harvard Aging Brain Study, and we divided them on the basis of whether on their PET scan they showed evidence of elevated amyloid or not. So the good news is, in blue here, that if you're a normal older person over 65 and you don't have much amyloid, when we test you every year, you get better over time. This is a perfect kind of practice effect that we see. We test people every year, they get better. Unfortunately, in red is the group of individuals who had high amyloid at baseline, and over time on these measures and what we call the preclinical Alzheimer cognitive composite, they tend to get worse over time. And something that was very interesting to me, I won't go through all these details, but they don't just get worse in memory. We think of Alzheimer's disease as a memory disorder, but actually it's not just memory. It's lots of things we call processing speed or executive function, multitasking. Almost all of these change over time in people who started out normal but had a lot of amyloid buildup in their brains. Now again, this is data from Harvard Aging Brain Study, single site. This is data from ADNI, and I bet you've heard of the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. People have heard of ADNI here? Anyone? All right, a couple, all right, good. So you guys are an ADNI site. And importantly, ADNI was actually started even before PET imaging was available. And using spinal fluid or PET imaging, we've now been able to follow these individuals in ADNI over time, out to 10 and actually now 12 years. And in fact, you see exactly the same pattern. So here in blue are the people who are normal, have low amyloid. In orange or red, people who have high amyloid. And again, over the first 2 years, there's not much change, but after 2, 3, and 4 years, unfortunately, the people at high amyloid begin to decline. And here, on the other graph, is showing you the likelihood that they start to have functional changes on a clinical dementia rating scale. This takes 4 to 6 years, but again, you see the same pattern, that those people who are normal, unfortunately, over time, have a high likelihood of progressing to having symptoms. So one of the questions I get asked a lot about is, well, there's some variability. Again, some people have amyloid and seem to be okay for 5 years, 6 years, maybe even 10 years. What are the things that increase the likelihood people will progress? So one of them is being female. So we've known for a long time that women have a somewhat higher likelihood of progressing to Alzheimer's dementia. That's partly because women live longer. It's also partly because we start out smarter. We perform higher, particularly on verbal memory tests, so we have farther to fall. But it's been a question for a long time whether women really are at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease or not. And this is some work of a fantastic postdoc in our group looking at women who have high amyloid versus men. And what you can see again here is that women actually start out performing better than men on this test, but over time they actually fall at a faster rate. And that's in particular because it's women who have APOE4. This is the most common late onset genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And it's been known actually for about 30 years that this genetic risk factor, for whatever reason, has more of an effect in women than in men, particularly if you have 2 copies of this risk gene. So unfortunately, this group here, shown in red, are women who have 2 copies of an E4 allele, and they have about an 85% likelihood of developing Alzheimer's dementia in a relatively short time frame. So far, I've only been talking about amyloid plaques. And I live in Boston. I get to work with people who study amyloid. So I live in amyloid land. But I think we all know, again, that it's not just amyloid. There are other factors that are really important. And one of them is those tau tangles I told you about. So one of the most exciting things was about 5 years or 6 years ago now, we were able to now not only image the amyloid plaques with these PET scans, but also the tau tangles. So here again at the stage of Alzheimer's dementia, even mild dementia, people have a head full of amyloid, and unfortunately they already have a lot of tau. And its tau is now spread beyond the part deep in the brain, the medial temporal lobe, out into the rest of the cortex. And unfortunately, this is the stage of disease that we run most of our trials. With anti-amyloid therapies, we're already trying people who have already not only have a lot of amyloid, they already have quite a bit of tau. Those most normal people don't have much amyloid. The good news is they don't have much tau, much tangles either, except in this early part of the brain in the medial temporal lobe. But one of the important findings early on was that these normal people who have high amyloid we can see evidence that the tau is actually spreading beyond the medial temporal lobe out into the rest of the brain, into the cortex. And unfortunately, this pattern is very suggestive that these people will develop cognitive impairment quickly, and I'll show you some of that. So here's some of that work from the Harvard Aging Brain Study. So when we look at people, we started scanning them with tau, which we started about 4 years into the study. There aren't very many people with very high amyloid and very high tau, because if you do, you're not likely to stay normal. But this is what happens to those people's cognition over time if they have high levels of both. So it's a small group, but within 2 years, many of them progress to mild cognitive impairment. So this is my second Mother Nature analogy, and I know that this is a very sad one to talk about in California with all you've been through, but one of the questions in our field is whether somehow amyloid might accelerate the spreading of tau. I'm not sure we're ready to say that amyloid causes tau. I think that we don't have evidence for that, but I do think there's evidence that in the setting of high amyloid, we see this wildfire kind of spreading of tau. So this is what it looks like. My husband, who does all this beautiful tau PET imaging, refers to this as the catastrophe, pun intended, where you see this rapid spreading of tau, almost like a wildfire, through the brain, which can occur even within a couple of years. So here's the relationship between amyloid and tau. So this is cross-sectional data, where we look at everybody at one point, and the first thing to note is that this is not a straight line. It's got a curve, which means after a certain level of amyloid, somehow the tau is taking off. And again, it's not clear to me that once you're up here in tau, the changing amyloid can fix the tau issue. And this is more recent longitudinal data. So now we're following these people over time, and you can see all of these people in red who have this rapid increase in tau. They started out this study as normal, but all of these people in red have already progressed to mild cognitive impairment. And it's associated with this rapid wildfire spreading of tau. So I've been talking mostly about Alzheimer's disease and amyloid and tau, but I'd be remiss, especially with Dr. Kawas and other people here, who've pointed out many times that vascular disease, cardiovascular and cerebrovascular stroke risk factor is really important for thinking. And I was one of those people who was not right about this. I was totally wrong. I thought of vascular disease over here and Alzheimer's disease over here. And the more we study this, we realize that they actually interact, and they interact very importantly in this preclinical phase. So here is a cardiovascular risk score. You've probably heard of it, the Framingham risk score, which you can look to see what's your risk of stroke or heart attack in the next 10 years. So if you have a high cardiovascular risk score, let me see if I can make this go, cardiovascular risk score, and you have high amyloid, that is the group who is declining over time. And most importantly, what we've now seen is that that vascular risk interacts with the amyloid to actually cause an increase in the tangles. So for me, it's no longer that it's vascular disease and Alzheimer's disease as being separate. They actually work together, unfortunately, very well synergistically to increase these tangles and cause higher likelihood of cognitive decline. So resilience. This is one of the most important things that we can do, which is, I don't think at the moment we have a way to prevent amyloid or tau, although I'm going to show you what we're trying. We do have ways, though, however, of reducing cardiovascular risk and ways of making our brain more resilient, potentially, to the effects of amyloid and tau on our brain. So this is actually some work that really surprised me that we published last year, which is about exercise. And again, I've always thought exercise is really important for cardiovascular fitness and preventing stroke, but this actually suggested that it interacts again with amyloid to try to help protect people's brains from cognitive decline. And you know, you've all heard that 10,000 step thing. I've only done 7,000 today. I looked before, but in fact, we looked and it looks like it's about 9,000 steps, or 8,900, to be protective against amyloid effects for cognitive decline. And this is showing that evidence again. Up here in this yellow are people of high amyloid and low physical activity. And those people, unfortunately, are very high risk for decline. And in the setting of having high amyloid, but if you were a person who's walking more than 9,000 steps, you can somewhat at least attenuate that decline, at least over this period of 6 to 8 years. And then this is also just showing you it's not just cognitive decline. You can actually slow the brain shrinkage that is associated with Alzheimer's disease with this exercise early on. So I think there is something we can do while we're waiting for a disease-modifying therapy. All right, so whenever I get to this point in my talk, someone, or probably most of you, are inevitably thinking about this. Why would you possibly want to know or tell somebody that you think that they're very likely to develop Alzheimer's disease dementia a decade from now, if, of course, there's nothing we can do about it? And I hope I'm going to convince you in the second half of my talk that this is exactly the way we're going to do something about it, just like we have in every other field of medicine where we've made real inroads. We detect disease before its symptoms. You go to your doctor, you get a blood test, you get a scan. We have ways of detecting disease before people come into our office complaining of symptoms. And I think that's what we need to do in Alzheimer's disease. So we've had a roller coaster in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials. You can't open the newspaper or read anything or listen to the news without hearing about one more giant failure in Alzheimer's disease clinical trials. I wake up every morning and steel myself for the news of the day. We've had now 13 phase 3 trial failures. I'll put a little asterisk because I think we don't yet know ultimately what will happen with what the most current trial that's being considered aducanumab, but we'll see. There's another reason for being able to go earlier in Alzheimer's disease. It's estimated that if we could stop dementia or just delay it by 5 years, that we would decrease our Medicare costs by nearly 50% in our country. And that's because, of course, the expensive part of Alzheimer's disease is that late stage when people really need care. And if we could move that out by 5 years, people get a chance to die of something else. And I always like to say, they will die out ballroom dancing instead of in a nursing home. And I know all the men here especially wish to die ballroom dancing. But it really does. There's a huge public health reason why if we could just move this out by 5 or 10 years, we don't have to cure Alzheimer's disease. We just have to delay the terrible part of it where people need care and can't live independently. And as I've already mentioned, this should not be surprising. Think about cancer, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, HIV, AIDS, osteoporosis, any one of these diseases where we've really made a dent. And it's because we detect the disease before people are at the stage that symptoms are really bothering them. And unfortunately, we have less likelihood of being able to keep people well. So this leads to the idea of prevention. Now, what we've been doing in our field so far, I'll call tertiary prevention or treatment. And I do think that we've made some real inroads by moving from the stage of dementia to an earlier stage. We call it mild cognitive impairment or prodromal Alzheimer's disease. And if we've seen some glimmers, and I think there's still glimmers, of success in recent trials, I think it's largely because we've moved here to MCI. We all want what we call primary prevention. We want something safe enough to put in the drinking water of everybody over the age of 18. But you know, those 70-year trial designs, really hard to get funded. And of course, we don't have something safe enough to put in the drinking water yet, but we will someday get to primary prevention, whether it's a vaccine or an oral agent where we can give to people at high risk way before they even have the earliest evidence of amyloid or tau in their brains. But right now, we're really focused on what I'll call secondary prevention. And public health experts debate what secondary prevention means. Here, I'm defining it as people who have changes in their brain consistent with the beginning of Alzheimer's disease, but they don't yet have symptoms. And these prevention trials are really trying to prevent them from progressing to the stage that we see with cognitive impairment. So, as Josh mentioned to you, I had the honor of leading something called the A4 study. And I know that there are staff and some participants and study partners and A4 and Learn. I won't ask you to stand up because I think confidentiality is critical, but I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because without you, the next data I'm going to show you would not be possible. So the A4 study is the first of its kind secondary prevention trial. People have to be 65 to 85. And it's a trial where we're testing an antibody against these amyloid buildup in the brain in people who are still clinically normal, trying to prevent them from developing cognitive decline. So it is the first of its kind, as I said, phase 3, which means it's a registration trial for the FDA. And I have to give the FDA credit here because they changed their guidelines for the first time in 37 years to allow trials like A4 and other prevention trials to go forward, where they said you can use a cognitive outcome only and allowed us to be able to do this kind of design with an accelerated approval. So we have 67 sites in the US, Canada, Australia, and Japan. It's a pretty large trial. 1,150 was our enrollment goal at these 67 sites. And we also studied people who screen failed, who didn't have evidence of amyloid buildup, and they came into a LEARN study funded by the Alzheimer's Association. And I'll show you a tiny bit of data around what we call the amyloid disclosure study. This is what Josh Grill and others work on, because we thought it was important in this study to tell people what we found on their amyloid scans so they could make a decision about that, whether they wanted to come into this trial or not. And of course, if any of these trials work, we've got to figure out what do we tell people about their amyloid scans and other biomarkers. So here's the idea behind A4. The elevated amyloid group, again, has this decline. The not elevated group in blue stays relatively stable over the course of these 4 years. And our job in the A4 study is to see, can we move this curve from the high amyloid closer to the low amyloid over the course of this 4.5-year study. And of course, we're not going to perfectly make everyone up to as though they had a memory back when they were 25, and we probably won't get them all the way up to even if they had no amyloid in their brain. But if we can bend that curve by 30% at this stage of the disease, we can prevent potentially half the cases of Alzheimer's disease dementia. Because again, they'll die out ballroom dancing before they get to that terrible stage of disease. So we started this study actually in 2014. And in order to find the perfect fit, these people who had high amyloid but were still normal, we had to do quite a bit of screening. So we screened about 15,000 people on the web or on the telephone, and over 6,000 of them came into these 67 centers to get testing. And importantly, we got amyloid PET scans on 4,486 of them. So that's a lot of PET scans. And it really allowed us to start to look at the factors associated with high amyloid versus those that were not, and determine, hopefully help us in future trials. So we had predicted that 30% of the people over age 65 who met all of our criteria would have elevated amyloid. And it turned out to be 29.5%. So that prediction was really right on. And those individuals who had elevated amyloid could continue in screening and ultimately randomize into A4. We finished our randomization in December of 2017. We actually had to stop because we were oversubscribed for that 1,150. We enrolled about 540 into the LEARN study, and we're also following these individuals over 4.5 years. So I won't go through all of these numbers in detail because I know it's late. But it does give us the chance to actually say what's associated with amyloid and what isn't. So the first thing is being a little bit older is associated with amyloid, but it's only have a difference of less than a year. But I wanted to show you, for those of you who like statistics, that that's a very small p-value, which means the likelihood that this is by chance is very small. So we can detect with 4,486 very small differences, and that's important when I show you what's not associated with amyloid. So importantly, education. So we all think that high education is very important for Alzheimer's disease, and it probably is an important risk factor, but it doesn't really affect, unfortunately, whether you're building up amyloid in your brain. It just allows you to hide your symptoms related to amyloid or Alzheimer's disease for longer. Being a female, although as I showed you this risk factor, you're more likely to show decline for a given amount of amyloid, being female doesn't actually increase your likelihood of having amyloid pathology in your brain. Now this next one, marital status, I'm going to celebrate my 30th wedding anniversary in May, so this really bummed me out that being married for 30 years is not protective at all, and that none of your marital status is. Also, retirement. So we've known, again, early retirement is a risk factor for progression to dementia, but being retired early or not does not affect your level of amyloid either. These are all important things, and I'll show you some lifestyle, because it does suggest that a lot of these factors that are associated with risk of dementia or cognitive decline are probably not operating through whether or not you have elevated amyloid or not. So one of the big risk factors that is genetics, and APOE4, this genetic risk factor I mentioned to you before. So I always, Dennis Selko, who I mentioned, always likes to say, the best thing you can really do is choose your parents wisely. Because unfortunately, one of the biggest risk factors for amyloid is having genetics, and in particular, this APOE4. But if you chose your parents very wisely, and you have an E2 allele, especially if you have 2 copies, your chances of having high amyloid in this age range are negligible. So we can say, at least for this is quite protective against amyloid. Now, family history is important above and beyond APOE4. So as you can see, all the people who came into AE4 actually had a pretty high level of family history, and that shouldn't be surprising. Who's going to come in and volunteer for a clinical trial worried about Alzheimer's disease? The people who've seen it up close and personal in their families are more likely, and I count myself among these because my grandfather died of Alzheimer's disease and my dad died 3 years ago. So I know how motivating it is to people who've seen this up close and personal in their families for wanting to come into these studies. But we can still say that people who have a stronger family history are more likely to have a family history, are also more likely to have high amyloid. So there is some risk overall. Now this one is probably the most surprising finding we had. So we're very interested in looking at lifestyle factors because, as I showed you in that pedometer data for walking, I do think that many of these lifestyle factors are critically important for building resilience in your brain. But quite interestingly, they're not associated with protective factors against building up amyloid in your brain. And we had some hints of this from other studies where we would look at all of these factors. And of course, I take care of marathon runners and vegans and people who still get Alzheimer's disease even though they did everything right. And here I think is evidence that at least these lifestyle factors at late stage don't protect you against amyloid, but I do think we'll see that they may protect you over time in showing the signs, the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. The only one that got close, importantly, is sleep. So sleep has been associated with, especially slow wave sleep, getting lots of sleep in the late part of the night, that may be associated with lower amyloid and lower tau. But even with all these numbers, that didn't get to significance. So one of the most interesting things we found, so all these people are normal who came in to screen for the A4 study, and they all have to be in a very narrow slice of how they fit in our cognitive testing. And we first test them at their very first visit before they get their amyloid PET scans, before they know even if they're eligible to get an amyloid PET scan. But what we can see here is that those who are amyloid positive or high amyloid, at screening, they don't perform quite as well as the group who doesn't have amyloid. And now this is a small effect overall, but again, these people are in a very narrow range, and it suggests that even at the beginning, these people have a little bit of memory problems. And interestingly, you can see this on every one of the cognitive tests that's part of our composite. And even when you adjust for age and education and sex, you can see this finding. The mini mental status examination you've heard about, that's the only one that's not significant when you adjust. But all of these other tests, especially some of these memory tests, are very slightly less good in people who have high amyloid, even at the beginning of the study. Now, I mentioned to you that Dr. Stark and Dr. Yasso have been working on very cool cognitive tests here. Well, they were kind enough to lend us one of their tests to put on a computer. And we actually use this on an iPad, on a tablet that we test people on not just doing these pencil and paper tests. And you can see that using these tests with a pattern separation, a face name, and a card playing task, we can also see that people with high amyloid perform, unfortunately, less well than people who have low amyloid, even at the beginning of the study. And this is really exciting to me because this is a computerized test that people do by themselves. It takes about 30 minutes. And if one day we might be able to do this for helping to screen people or in longitudinal and cognitive outcomes, this will make our trials much more efficient. This is work of Dr. Josh Grill. So one of the questions that came up very often is this question of behavioral changes early in this. So it's not just memory and thinking that change early. People also often report that they've had depressive symptoms or very commonly anxiety. So this is evidence that even before people get their PET scan, they haven't learned whether they have high amyloid or not. We do see evidence that there's already heightened anxiety in people who have high amyloid, even before they know it or we know it. And I do think that one of the important things we're learning is that some of the neurobehavioral or psychiatric symptoms that occur very early often coexist with the cognitive changes. And importantly, these are outcomes in our trials to see if we can prevent these from progressing as well. So one last piece of data on A4 is something called the Cognitive Function Index. So this is a simple question where we ask people to rate compared to a year ago. Do they have more trouble with, using a smartphone or using a laser pointer? Or do they have more trouble with planning trips? Or have they noticed, are they a little bit worried about their memory, even though they're still normal? And it's a very simple 15-item question, yes, no, or maybe. Here is the participant data, and those who have high amyloid reported that they were more likely to have these changes over the past year, even though they're still normal. And importantly, this questionnaire is given, again, way before, about a month before they get their PET scan. So it's not biased by whether they know they have high amyloid or not. Importantly, the participant themselves is more likely to notice these changes than their study partner. And that makes sense because these are normal people, and the study partner probably hasn't noticed changes as much as the person themselves has. But this is really important because I was always taught when I was training in neurology that if someone comes in to you and they tell you they're worried about their memory, you can pat them on the head and send them home and say, you don't have Alzheimer's disease. Because if you had Alzheimer's disease, you would have forgotten that you forget. And that is true at later stages of Alzheimer's disease. People get this thing called anosognosia, where people do lose insight. But early on, we should pay attention when someone says, I've really noticed a significant change in the past year in my ability to do these high-level things, particularly if there's not another good reason for that. And lastly, this is that going back to the tau PET. So in the A4 study, we were really lucky to be able to bring in tau PET, even though it was a brand new technology. And we got about 390 individuals who got a tau PET scan before they started into the A4 study. And this is a map I'm showing you of a tau PET image of the average of the 390 individuals, showing you where in the brain more amyloid is associated with more tau. All of these people are still normal. All of them have high amyloid. And yet you can see that more amyloid goes with more tau in these parts of the brain, even before people have symptoms. So again, we should stop fighting about whether it's amyloid or tau. We should just figure out how to prevent the tau from spreading. So the rationale, again, amyloid accumulates 2 decades before we get to the stage of significant impairment. We can see these detectable subtle changes in cognition, especially memory, but in other facets as well. More on that tau PET scan I just showed you, more than half of the people who came into A4 of high amyloid already have tau that's spreading out into the brain. And the thing that keeps me up most at night is, what if A4 is too late? I don't really think it's too late, but it did make me feel like we have to move even earlier to try to prevent the amyloid buildup before half of them have tau. Because once you have both, unfortunately, those people are at very high risk of decline. So why do we want to wait for that stage of disease to intervene? So this leads to the idea of how do we go even earlier? So here, I don't know if you can see the red and black very well, but the red lines are the E4 carriers, the black lines are the non-carriers. Here, these are all normal people in the Harvard Aging Brain Study where we have longitudinal imaging now. And you can see that unfortunately, once you're above in this level, 1.2, you're only going in one direction. So once people start to accumulate, that rate of accumulation is very constant, whether you're an E4 carrier or not. And at any age, you can see that these people are starting to go up. But these people who are already quite high at age 65 or 70, they started to accumulate their amyloid over here when they were 50 or 55. And so that led to the question about could we go even earlier? This is a lot of mumbo jumbo of mediation analysis. But what's important is that we can now see that this early amyloid level begets increase in amyloid, which begets tau, and that's how you get to cognitive decline. So the question is, where can we intervene in this process to be able to prevent that? We know now that right at that point where amyloid starts to accumulate, there's a sweet spot. You can see in all of these data, right before people start to have this rapid accumulation of amyloid, that we want to intervene to try to prevent them from getting a head full of amyloid. And that's the idea behind what we'll call the A3 study. So A3, coming before A4, are trying to find people who don't yet have a head full of amyloid and trying to prevent them from getting amyloid. A4-5, the next study, will take people of a lot of amyloid and try to be aggressive and prevent them from having cognitive decline. That's what this just says in words. You heard about this from Josh already. This is going to be the AHEAD study, the AHEAD 3-4-5 study. It will start this May, and one of the most thrilling things to me is that this will go down to age 55 so that we can catch those people, hopefully, who are on the way up before they get to the point of having very significant pathology. We also are going to try a bit more for personalized medicine so that we're treating people on the basis of how much amyloid they have. So people have a lot of amyloid, we're going to be very aggressive in the A4-5 and try to knock them down to a low level, below the A4, down to the A3 level. And at that point, we'll keep them on maintenance therapy, like we do in cancer. We do induction therapy and then maintenance therapy. We need potentially to do that in Alzheimer's disease. And in that group who doesn't have a lot of amyloid but is just on the way up, our job is to try to prevent them from getting to that amount of amyloid that's associated with tau and cognitive decline. This is a public-private philanthropic partnership. Again, it will start, I can't wait, in May 2020, because this one's been more than 2 years in the planning, but it's thrilling to have another shot on goal, because here we're using a different antibody that's really good at reducing plaque or protofibrillar forms of amyloid. So I'll end with this, that often when I give this kind of talk and people are thinking, she's nuts, this is crazy, it sounds heretical, but I talk to my cardiology friends. And in the 60s, they used to have huge fights about whether cholesterol had anything to do with heart disease. And they would write really nasty letters to each other in the New England Journal of Medicine saying, you ignorant moron, cholesterol has nothing to do with heart disease. And other people would say, oh no, it's the greatest risk factor. And of course, both are true. Cholesterol, we had to figure out how to measure it. We had to learn about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. And importantly, we had to start treating cholesterol before people were at the stage that they were in the ICU. Because if someone's got heart failure in the ICU and you lower their cholesterol, unfortunately, it doesn't make their heart work better. What's really changed heart disease is using statins in people either before they had a heart attack at all, or they had heart pain, cardiac pain, or a heart attack but still had good function, and it can prevent the next heart attack. And that's the idea. And very similar to the idea of A3, we used to treat people with cholesterols above 300, and then 250, and then 200. And now we treat people often with normal cholesterol levels who have high risks for other vascular disease. And I think that's what we'll do in Alzheimer's disease. I've talked mostly tonight about prevention, but that is not to say that we shouldn't be treating people who have symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, because we must. But I suspect that we're going to need more than just amyloid at that stage of disease. I think we're going to need to go after tau, inflammation, neuroprotective agents, because once people are having symptoms, unfortunately, that pathology's already been there for quite a long time, so we're going to have to be aggressive. AD is a formidable opponent. I think it's going to be tougher than heart disease. So we're going to have to be pretty bold to defeat it. So my last Mother Nature analogy is a tsunami. And often people talk about Alzheimer's disease as a tsunami coming at us for public health. But I'm not sure tsunami is a good analogy, because a tsunami is once in a lifetime wave. And unfortunately for Alzheimer's disease, it's wave after wave after wave. So we're going to have to be bold. We're going to have to give these little people in the lifeboat a fighting chance. And I think one of the ways we're going to do that is treating early and treating aggressively. So I'll end by acknowledging the amazing group of people who've contributed to this, both from in Boston, where I'm from, at the Harvard Aging Brain Study, at lots of people around at the ACTC, the A4 teams, again, the research participants and their study partners who've been willing to go on these roller coaster rides with us. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. So thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to answer some questions. Thank you. Yes. You have to yell loudly, but I'll try to repeat it so everyone can hear. Is that okay? Yep. All right, good question. So the first one is about genetic markers and how many do we use. And I'll say in A4, we don't use the genetic markers to define this disease, because in this case, we really wanted to define it on the basis of biomarkers of imaging. But there is something you may have heard of called polygenic risk, where we actually can look at up to 10,000 genetic markers. The real problem, though, is that APOE is way up here, and the other 9,999 are down here. So there are important other genetic markers. A lot of them are around the immune system, around inflammation, and they do increase the risk, but at this moment, it's hard to use them in a predictive algorithm. People are trying. I don't think we're there yet, other than APOE. The second is about the vaccine. I love that you say it was Harvard, but sadly, Harvard didn't invent that vaccine. But there was the first kind of immunotherapy was an active vaccine against amyloid beta. And this was back, I think about 15, 16 years ago already now. And that trial was stopped because people got what we call meningoencephalitis, inflammation. And it was really awful. About 6% of people got pretty bad meningoencephalitis. Some people did die. And unfortunately, we saw in people, these were all people who already had dementia, that we cleared the amyloid out of some of these people's brains, and we didn't make them better. And I think it took quite a long time for, one, people to be brave enough to say we're going to try the immune system, and that led to these antibodies. So here, instead of trying to make the brain make the antibodies out of control, which happened there with inflammation, you can give the antibodies, you give them every month, and you can turn them off. And so far, at least, we haven't seen the same level of encephalitis that was seen. But it's still an issue, because I would love to have a vaccine for Alzheimer's disease. If A4, A3, 4, 5 work, we got to figure out a way to give this to people around the world, and a vaccine would be the easiest way. But we've got to figure out how to do it in a safe way, and we don't have that yet. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Like you, Dr. Sperling, I'm a committed CK, not church kid, but KWAS.
Okay.
Committed KWASian.
I love it.
And the last couple times that I've heard Claudia speak, she has mentioned that among people in the 90-plus study, there's a number of people that she's noticed who do not have a large amount of amyloid plaque or tau, but
Yes.
are showing clear signs of Alzheimer's. You didn't mention that tonight. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Absolutely. So I won't speak for the famous CK, but I think she's right here, which is to say, especially as we get older, so especially above 90, even above 85 though, I think it's less clear that amyloid and tau drive most of Alzheimer's dementia. In fact, or dementia, not just Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, part of the reason we stopped these trials, one at age 85 and in fact A345 at 80, is that the older you get, the more I think it's multifactorial. And I think these people who don't have any of the pathologies, not strokes, not amyloid, not tau, who still show us dementia, I think there are clues there that we don't yet know. What is changing in their brains that leads to the loss of the function of the nerve cells, even though we can't measure the pathology. I'll also say that even though I'm defining here amyloid as the way into the trial, I have no illusions that amyloid is the only thing going on in these people. And I think it's very likely that vascular disease, the unknown X factor that causes dementia later, these are things I can't measure and unfortunately don't have drugs to fix. But I hope that maybe amyloid, it will be like cholesterol. So let's say it accounts for 28%. So lowering cholesterols decrease cardiac morbidity and mortality by 28% in our country. And the cardiologist bemoan is only 28%. Well, if I could change 28% of Alzheimer's disease through amyloid, even if it's only a piece, I think that's worth doing. So that's where I'm focused now. But when we figure out the CK factor, we'll name that, we should find a way to treat it too. Other questions? Yes, please. I know I don't have a blind side on the left side. I'm coming over here, but please go. Oops, nope, I'm following the mic. Yes.
I know your talk's on prevention, but for those of us that have relatives
Yes.
who are already at that stage, do you recommend that they get scanned for amyloids, or my relatives in the mild memory loss stages?
Yes.
What would your recommendations be at this time for that?
So at this moment, I'd say the best thing would be to try to come into a clinical trial until we have an approved medication. I don't recommend right now that people go out and get scans for a couple reasons. One is it's not covered by insurance yet. And secondly, it won't change what I would tell them to do right now. That will completely change if we have a disease-modifying therapy against amyloid. And we're all holding our breath to know if that will happen now or in 5 years from now, and I really don't know. But at this moment, for my own patients, and I don't recommend going to get a scan. I do recommend trying to stay mentally and physically and socially active. I do think that trying to build that resilience at that stage of early dementia is one of the most important things we can do. And so I'm very aggressive about that. I do treat people with drugs that are symptomatic because I think they help a little bit. And if we can keep people functioning well enough until we can get a disease-modifying therapy, I think that's what we need to do. Yes, or whoop, following wherever she goes.
Any opportunities to get into this whatever it was, 345?
Oh, yes.
Here in Southern California or Irvine?
Absolutely. So the great news, again, UC Irvine was a fantastic A4 site, so they're one of our first choices for being in A345. And again, I think we'll begin screening in May or June here. We'll have 100 centers around the country and other countries as well. So it'll be a little bit bigger, actually, than A4, but absolutely. And actually, right now, there's a study, just shameless plug, but there's a study where we're trying to build a trial-ready cohort. It's called TrackPad, or the Alzheimer Prevention Trial Web Study. We're trying to help kind of pre-screen people by doing tests on the web that'll help us try to find the people who are most likely to qualify. Because it took us 3 years to enroll the A4 study, and we have to go faster than that if we want to try multiple good drugs. So you can talk to that man right there about TrackPad or other trials, because I do think we want to be ready. We want to hit the ground running for the AHEAD study. Yes. Who's got the mic? Right in there. All right.
I was just wondering, this is a very powerful, powerful lecture. Will it be available online to watch it again?
I think so, because I think I signed my life away that they could live stream it. So I think so.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll have some progress to tell you about next year. But yes, I think it will be available. Yes.
Hi, for someone like me, I'm in my mid-50s who, I don't know if I'd be vulnerable to this or not, but Are there some, lifestyle changes like exercise, diet, or anti-inflammatory supplements or anything like that, mental exercises that can slow the progress of anything that may or may not be there?
Yes, so I think that's an excellent question. It's about what can you do if you're mid-50s and you're worried about this, either you have a family history, what can you do? So there's been a lot of work. The National Academy of Medicine tried to do these prevention kind of task force to figure out. I'd say the only one that I have found data convincing for so far is exercise. So pretty good evidence that exercise is protective, again, not against getting amyloid, but probably against making your brain more resilient. And exercise changes brain chemistry. In fact, Carl Kottman, who's here, works on brain-derived neural growth factor, said this a long time ago, but more recently it's been shown that exercise may actually help your brain be more resilient. So I do think I recommend that. I don't always practice what I preach, but I try to go to dance class 3 times a week. I am not a person who believes in mental exercises. So lots of my patients do Sudoku and crossword puzzles, and if they like them, that's great, but there's not evidence that that's really protective. And I really try to encourage people to go out and do things with other people, new things. So not staying at home doing mental exercises on their own. If it's fun, great, but I don't think it's protective, and I'd much rather people go out ballroom dancing or take a class or join something with other people, because I think there is evidence that physical and social exercise. Diet, I think we don't know. Some evidence that Mediterranean diet and eating lots of blueberries and salmon may, again, be good for your brain, but not clear that it's protective. Anti-inflammatory medications, not unfortunately protective. Pretty good evidence for that. Statins, another one, maybe a hint, but really not clear that it's prevention. So I feel like the only one at the moment is that you should run up and down the stairs 20 times before you leave tonight, so far. All right, anything else? Yes.
As a Canadian, I've been trying to get into studies, but have been unable to make contact. Do you have any universities in Western Canada specifically that are involved?
Yes, so I can say we actually have a University of British Columbia site for A4, and I think are likely also to. In fact, we'll have at least 5 Canadian sites. I know I actually don't know whether there's a central site in Canada. I can try. I know the eastern site's a little bit better. The Alzheimer's Association has something called Trial Match. You can look there, but I don't know whether they keep as much information about Canada. But there are definitely a few sites on the West Coast in Vancouver who are doing studies, for sure. Sure? Yes?
I appreciate your simile between cardiology and atherosclerosis and amyloid. What is the basics of amyloid? How does it start? What is it? I mean, what's are the processes that lead to deposition or formation of amyloid? And are there any of the herbal supplements that we see advertised on TV all the time, and Prevision and all that stuff? Any of that work at all, or is that?
So it's a good question about, what does amyloid do? Why do we get it? Actually, the analogy there to cholesterol is particularly good, right? So cholesterol is a normal protein or lipid carrying that you have. And if you don't want to have no cholesterol, you actually get really depressed and eventually die. But having imbalance or abnormal cholesterol metabolism is critically important for vascular disease. And I think it's similar. Amyloid is a protein product of this protein we all have called amyloid precursor protein. It gets chopped up lots of ways. And that's probably important. We don't really know why. But if you don't have that precursor protein or it's not chopped up, those, at least mice, if they have that, are very stupid mice. So there's probably something important in learning and memory, but we don't know. And it may be that amyloid is just a byproduct of this normal protein cleavage that happens. And it is kind of amazing to me that 30 years after some of these discoveries about amyloid, we don't really know the normal function of amyloid precursor protein in the brain. We do know, however, that probably you produce it your whole life. And at late life Alzheimer's disease, it's not that you're producing more, it's that you can't clear it. And there are many other proteins like this, Parkinson's disease, caused by a different protein, alpha-synuclein. Same thing, normally produced, but you can't, it starts to aggregate, it accumulates. And some people really talk about this. Unfortunately, as we get older, we're not as efficient at emptying our nerve cell garbage. It's really probably at that level. Amyloid is one of the most frequently turned over proteins in the brain. That may be why it's particularly shows up early, not because it's the one. Having said that, the genetic forms of Alzheimer's disease, I didn't talk about this, but these rare genetic forms, autosomal dominant, so they're called presenilin 1, presenilin 2, they are all overproduction of amyloid. So all of the genetic causes of Alzheimer's disease we know are related to amyloid. Trisomy 21, Down syndrome, that amyloid precursor protein is on the 21st chromosome. So 100% of people who have Down syndrome, trisomy 21, get Alzheimer's disease. So there is good genetic evidence that's involved. But why in older people you stop being able to get rid of that protein? That is the $100 billion, trillion question that, and until we figure that out, my job's to try to help the brain clear it, and that's what these antibodies do. Okay, one more. Yes.
First, I want to thank you and your colleagues for all this exciting research you're doing. I've noticed that music seems to be a significant component to the management of people with dementia, not only calming, but recalling their incidents from past younger days. Is there an explanation that you have for how music can be so diffusely involved and beneficial for brain function?
Well, actually, I know that Josh gave a talk on this weekend. I didn't get to see it, so he might be able to answer that better. But I'll say one of the real things is that I think in Alzheimer's disease, when you see a patient with Alzheimer's disease, their memory for things 20 years ago, 50 years ago is perfect. Sometimes it's even better than, because these things that were so important to them before their brain developed these problems is really reassuring to them. You know, you often will tell stories about when they were younger, but I think music is intrinsic to that. It's something we grew up with, it's part of our souls, and it's part of us that was there before the Alzheimer's disease just ravaged people's brains. I also think music is the universal language, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that music is helpful, and I actually was talking with Josh about this. I'd love to see a better controlled study of how do we use this in a better way. Because although he thinks it has to be the music you like, I personally think that everyone has to love Beethoven, and I don't care what music you like, that's what you should listen to. But I do actually think music, I also think dance. I think there are a lot of things that we should exploit that people love to do or they loved to do when they were younger, and how do we help them when they're suffering from this disease to enjoy that. Because the most important thing, the person who asked me about symptoms, I failed to say this, the most important thing for people of symptomatic Alzheimer's disease is to help them enjoy their life and help their families enjoy this time with them. And I do think that music is part of that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys staying. Thanks a lot.
So the one promise I did keep to Dr. Sperling was that I didn't tell the audience that she's probably the only Alzheimer's researcher who performed on Broadway.
As a rabbit.
So as a rabbit, as it were. And you know, I think you get a sense of her stage presence has been with her for a while now. Thank you all for joining us. I want to give a small token to Dr. Sperling for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. We hope that you enjoyed this. Thank you for braving Super Corona Tuesday. And we hope to see you next year. Drive safely.